Great, welcome, Dave. Thanks for inviting me. Everybody, thanks for showing up. As Dave mentioned, my name's Mike Smith. I'm a faculty at Carnegie Mellon, and I teach in our Information Systems Management program. I wanted to give you a little bit of background on me, and then also talk about some of my research and how it pertains to some of the stuff that you'll learn at Carnegie Mellon if you decide to join our program. So a little bit of background about me. I've got a bachelor's in electrical engineering and a master's in telecommunications science, which sat at the interface between technology and management. So it was kind of like the master's that we have at Carnegie Mellon, in the sense that it was designed to increase your technical skills while also adding in a bunch of managerial skills. I've worked I started in a management rotation program at GTE, which was a phone company. So I worked for 6 months in their labs group. I worked for 6 months as a product manager, and I worked for another 6 months in sales support. And then I worked for GTE for another 5 years as a internal consultant. And then I worked for Booz Allen and Hamilton as a client manager, as a consultant for them. Along the way, I got this crazy idea to get a PhD. So my PhD is from MIT Sloan School, at the interface, again, between technology and management. So a lot of what I do and a lot of what I'm passionate about is thinking really hard, not about the technology necessarily, not about the management necessarily, not about the public policy necessarily, but about how all these things come together. And honestly, I think that's where the really cool questions are right now. So there are a bunch of nice people in computer science who think about the technology, and I think that's great. There are a bunch of nice people in the business school who think about the management, and again, I think that's great. And then there are a bunch of people at public policy schools who think about how do we design public policies that benefit society, and I think that's great. What I'm really passionate about is how do all these things mix together, right? So when you change the technology that underlies the system, what changes do you need to make to how you manage the system, and what changes do you need to make to the public policy approaches that we put in place? One place where this applies is in the context of my research, which is how do information systems change markets and competition? And you can think about this in a variety of settings. The setting I wanted to focus on today is the entertainment industry. So my colleague Rahul Talang and I run a center at Carnegie Mellon called the Initiative for Digital Entertainment Analytics. We work with all 5 of the major Hollywood studios on how technology is changing their business. So we look at what does it mean, what does piracy mean for your business? When you release content on legal channels, how should you release it? So for a while there was this, really thorny question of, should I release my content on iTunes before, at the same time, or after I release it on DVD? Right now, the big question is, should firms like Warner Brothers and Disney release movies on their platforms on the same day as they release it in theaters, or several weeks or to a couple months after they release it in theaters? Those are the questions that we play around with. Along the way, though, Rahul and I got really interested in, these are kind of operational questions. How should you, when should you release something? How should you deal with piracy? What prices should you set for your content? Great questions, but we started to wonder whether those were really the most important questions the industry ought to be asking. And we decided to write a book. This book came out in 2016 called Streaming, Sharing, Stealing: Big Data and the Future of Entertainment, where we asked a couple higher level questions, which is technology changing the traditional power that motion picture studios have had in their business? Will the introduction of technology to the entertainment industry hurt the quality of entertainment? And then what can industry leaders in the entertainment industry do to respond to these changes? So let me walk through these. And as I'm walking through, by the way, if you do have a question, feel free to stop me. There are only 20 of us here, so I can handle questions. You can either just unmute yourself and jump in, or you can type in a question to the chat. I can see the chat right here, and I'd be happy to answer it. So the first question we wanted to play around with is this one. Is technology changing power in the entertainment industry? And this question came up in the context of a talk in 2015. So in 2015, Rahul and I invited the president of home entertainment at one of the big six at the time Hollywood studios to talk about how technology was changing his business. And at one point in the talk, Rahul, my colleague, asked him, hey, are you at all worried about the threat that Netflix and Amazon and Google might pose to your business? And this is what he said, direct quote, you know what, the original players in my industry have been around for the last 100 years. There's a reason for that. And the implication was that's not going to change. So 2015, Amazon, Netflix, and Google pose no threat to my business because I've never faced a threat to my business. I've always been in a powerful position in my business. Why would today be any different? And on one hand, you can make fun of him for that, but on the other hand, let's be honest that historically he's right. You know, historically, for the last 100 years, the same 6 big Hollywood studios have dominated the motion picture industry. And guess what? The same 5 or so record labels and the same 5 or so book publishers have dominated their industry. And it's not like the internet is the first technological shift that they've faced. In motion pictures, the motion picture industry has faced massive shifts over the last 100 years in how content is created, distributed, and consumed, and yet they've still maintained their dominant position. Why would today be any different? It's a perfectly reasonable question for them to ask. The other fun thing that we noticed was, if you look at what Rahul and I felt like were the big technological shifts they were facing, so the rise of user-generated content, the fact that anybody with a decent iPhone and even some people with Android phones can make pretty good content. You don't need a big, you don't need any of the expensive Hollywood cameras or editing software. It's all pretty much off the shelf. So a lot of people are making great content just by themselves. Long tail markets, which are markets that instead of being able to stock the 500 or so movies you could stock in a Best Buy superstore, are able to stock 5,000 or even 5 million different pieces of motion picture content. The rise of digital piracy, the fact that you can find most of these movies online for free through illegal sites and download them. The rise of big data. And the rise of very powerful downstream platforms like Netflix, Amazon, and Google. When we talked to the studios about these challenges, the consistent thing we heard back was none of these shifts pose a threat for my business. User-generated content is cute, but I'm in the professional content business. YouTube influencers don't really pose a threat to that part of my business. The other thing we heard was, long tail markets are fine, but I'm not in the business of making obscure content. And most of the stuff that isn't stocked at Best Buy is just obscure content. I'm in the business of making blockbusters. And so I don't see how long tail markets are going to change that. Digital piracy is bad, but it affects everybody in the market equally. Why, it's going to affect me, it's going to affect my competitors, but it's not going to change the competitive balance. Big data, and we'll come back to this in a second, big data isn't going to change the competitive landscape, because if you use data to make content, you're going to mess everything up. And we'll talk about that in a second. And then the last thing they said is, yeah, Netflix and Amazon and Google, they're powerful, but they still depend on me for the content creation. And let's see, I'm looking at Dylan in the chat. The thing that's not posing a threat doesn't mean that the process can't be improved. Yeah, just because of the fact that it's worked in the past. Dylan, totally agree with you. And we'll get there. So the point I want to make here is Dylan's right. This is a bigger problem than they were thinking. But when they looked at these different shifts separately, what they saw as experienced managers in the industry was that none of this poses a threat to me, or at least that was their opinion. Okay. And the reason, let's see, yeah, the digital piracy could be combated a lot if they treat it as shadow competition. Dylan, you're 100% right. A lot of our research has shown exactly that. There's this famous quote that you can't compete with free. What my colleague Rahul and I talk about is the fact that competing with free is just a special case of price competition. What you want to do is make the paid content better than the free content, and there are a whole bunch of ways you can do that. Okay. So why were the studios so confident in the face of these changes? Well, one of the reasons they were so confident is because of this industry phrase, which is content is king. So they felt like they had the content. Content has always been king. I've always been powerful. And in particular, when they looked at, when Rahul and I looked at their market, what we discovered is that the studios had been powerful for 100 years because they were able to control 3 forms of scarcity in the creation, distribution, and consumption of content. So they were able to control the scarce financial and technical resources necessary to create content. They were able to allocate, use the fact that there were scarce channels that you needed access to promote and distribute their content. And they were able to leverage scarcity there. And they were able to use copyright law to create an artificial scarcity in how, when, and where consumers got access to content. And none of the technological shifts they'd faced over the past 100 years had changed the value of any of these sources of scarcity. What we argue in the book is that the technological shifts they were facing in 2015, and quite frankly are still facing, were actually changing those sources of scarcity. So all of a sudden, like I said, anybody with a decent iPhone or an Android camera and some pretty basic low price software could create some incredible content. And all of a sudden, anybody had access to the channel. So if you want to upload your video to YouTube, no one's going to stop you. And we've seen an explosion in availability on other professional channels like Kindle and Netflix and iTunes. And then this last one is the rise of piracy. So this is Jack Sparrow. Jack Sparrow is a pirate. All of a sudden, the ability to control how, when, and where people get access to content just went away. Let's see, in the chat, Dylan, there's also word of mouth social advertising. Actually, yeah, exactly. It used to be that to promote a piece of content, I needed to have 30-second advertisements run on television. Today, you know, the social media advertising, word of mouth is in many ways much more popular than what you can get on primetime television. So all of this changed in a way, and it changed in a way that removed the power that you could get from these old forms of scarcity. And it creates what I'll argue is a new form of scarcity, which is customer attention. Customer attention is the new scarce resource. And guess what? Netflix, Amazon, Google, Apple, they're the people who control customer attention. They're the people who own the customer data and can promote content directly to them. And what's really terrifying, if you're a studio, is that each of these companies is vertically integrating into content creation and frankly doing a pretty darn good job of it. So all of a sudden, the studios faced a threat that they'd never faced before. Now let's go back here, and this gets to some of the stuff that Dylan is talking about in the chat. what do you make of these concerns? So I think they're right on each of these in a very narrow sense, that none of these by itself would necessarily pose a threat to the business. What they didn't realize is that these things weren't happening separately; they were happening all at the same time. And one of the chapter titles in our book is the perfect storm, where we argue that none of these things separately was a problem, but just like in the perfect storm, when you have three storms come together all at the same time, it can create a situation that you haven't faced before. In this case, what we argue in the book is that user-generated content, long-tail markets, and digital piracy were actually hurting their ability to compete in the old market. And the rise of powerful distribution platforms and the rise of big data was actually creating a new market that they didn't have the assets to compete in. So Netflix has a whole bunch of power because they control the customer, they control you. They know exactly what you watch, when you watch it, what device you watch it on, and they can promote content directly to you. The studios traditionally, at least before they got into their own distribution, the studios didn't know who any of their customers were. And they certainly didn't know how to promote content directly, or they certainly weren't able to promote content directly to them. So this was a fundamental change. The second thing we looked at was, will technology hurt the quality of entertainment? And what's really fun to me is that there were a lot of experienced professionals in the entertainment industry who argued that using data to create content would actually destroy the quality of the content. So this is John Landgraf, CEO of FX Television. There's a whole thing going on in Netflix right now and in Silicon Valley saying we're going to use algorithms to make creative decisions. I say posh, you can't. It's not like making a computer program that can work to the fixed and formal rules of chess. Sure, you can use technology to create a great chess player, but you're not going to be able to use technology and data to create a great storyteller. And then there's this other really interesting one from a guy named Carlton Cuse, who's an Emmy Award-winning showrunner, who says, not only can't you use data to create great content, but the explosion of content we're seeing is actually going to be bad for the business, in the same way that if the NFL were suddenly to expand to have 90 teams, it would be bad for the quality of football. You'd have a whole lot of football available to you, but the quality of it would be diluted. Right, and yeah, so I still think a lot of companies don't use big data as well as they possibly could. That's true. And let me give you an example of how I think they're using the data and how I think they're actually using the data in just a second. So what's interesting about these two objections, right? You can't use data, and if you and the explosion in content is going to be bad for creativity. What's really interesting about this is Netflix, Amazon, Google, Apple have been incredibly successful at creating great content. So if data is going to screw up the quality of content, then why are these data-driven firms making such good stories? And I think a lot of it comes back to this particular scene. I don't know if anybody's seen the first episode of Netflix's House of Cards, but this scene that what I'm going to show you is the opening scene to the pilot episode of Netflix's House of Cards. And this is how they introduce their main character, Frank Underwood. So let's just watch this together for fun.
Did you get a good look?
Blue Toyota Camry, it's all I saw.
It's the Hortons, dog. It's not gonna make it. Go see if they're home. It's okay. There are two kinds of pain. Sort of pain that makes you strong, or useless pain. Sort of pain that's only suffering. I have no patience for useless things. Moments like this require someone who will act. Who will do the unpleasant thing, the necessary thing. There. No more pain. It was a hit and run. I'm off.
Here's the question, right? Why did that scene work? Why wouldn't have that scene worked on traditional broadcast? So that's if you know, and I see at least one person in the chat, Jill remembers this scene. So if you know the story of House of Cards, that's an incredibly powerful way of introducing your main character, Frank Underwood, who is this brutally pragmatic politician who's willing to do the hard things that need to be done. So we now have a very clear view into Frank Underwood as a character, and that's a good way to start your episode historically. What's wrong with this scene? What's wrong with this scene is Frank Underwood just strangled a dog. And that's going to be pretty upsetting for some people. And in fact, let me show you another clip. This is Bo Willimon, who was the head writer on House of Cards, talking about the making of this of the writing associated with this scene.
Early on, there were a few people actually on the creative team who had worked on like production creative side that had worked in a lot of TV before, and they said, you can't kill a dog, you'll lose half your viewership in the first 30 seconds. I go, oh really? Is that, why? I mean, it's just a dog, right? Like, I mean, like you can kill as many humans as you want, but you kill a dog, you're gonna lose everyone. So I go to Fincher and I go, hey man, I really am into this opening. I think it really works for the opening of the show. People are telling me we'll lose half of our viewers when we kill this dog. And what do you think about that? He thinks for a second and goes, I don't give a shit. And I go, I don't either. He's like, let's do it. We weren't that cavalier about it, really, honestly, but we did feel that if you weren't going to be able to survive this dog strangling, this probably wasn't the show for you. So it was a great litmus test.
The guy on the other side of the stage is Michael Eisner, who used to be the CEO of Disney. And about 5 minutes later, he says, you know what, if I tried to include a similarly violent scene on an episode of broadcast television, the head of the network would call me, the chairman of the board would call me, I would be out in 10 minutes. And so the thought question, if we were doing this in class, the thought question for you would be, why did this scene work so well for Netflix? And it would have been a terrible scene to include in an episode of broadcast television. And I think the answer comes back to what's different about Netflix versus broadcast television. And a lot of that comes back to, on broadcast television, those, let's see, now we've got, okay, so fair enough. So it doesn't have to do with Netflix, but rather the audience of House of Cards versus other subsections. Let me just expand, because I think you're right about Netflix. You're right about the subset, but I think it does have to do with Netflix in the following way. If somebody tunes out of an episode of broadcast television because they don't like the fact that a dog was just killed, that's bad for the broadcaster. It means lower advertising revenue, and it means that person has probably switched over to one of my competitors' shows. So that's unequivocally bad. If somebody tunes out of Netflix's House of Cards, what are they probably going to do instead? And I think the argument is what they're probably going to do instead is watch something else. So let's see. I'll get back to Michael. I'll get back to your question about mixed reality, because I think that is, and surveillance capitalism and privacy are incredibly important questions. So yeah, Jill, Jill says Netflix has other channels for viewers to choose from. And so if somebody tunes out a House of Cards, they're probably going to watch something else on Netflix. And not only isn't that bad, like not only is that just fine for Netflix, it would have been bad for a traditional broadcaster, but it's not bad for Netflix. And in fact, I think you could argue that it's good in the sense that now Netflix has data about you. It knows that Michelle doesn't like it when dogs get strangled and Jill does. And so I could program content directly to the people based on what I know about their preferences. So seeing people make choices is actually good for Netflix when it would have been bad for the studios. And I personally think that's a big part of why we've seen so many of these data-driven companies be successful creating great content. It's because they're not using the data to determine how the content gets made. They're using the data to get the right content in front of exactly the right audience in a way that you just couldn't do with traditional broadcast channels, or even with traditional, motion picture theaters. It's very hard to do that level of targeting. These guys could. So what do we make of these two quotes, right? Are Mr. Landgraf and Mr. Cuse just ignorant? I don't think that's what it is. I think what it is due respect to both of them, because they're both great creators. I think they're using the metrics of quality that applied perfectly well to the old business, and they're applying it to the new business. So what I mean by that is, to John Landgraf's point, if you had data about when people tuned out of a show in a broadcast environment, of course you'd use that data to change the creative, because I don't want people tuning out of the show. Netflix was actually able to look at that data and say, probably not as crassly as Bo Willimon said in his quote, but they were able to say, I don't care if a bunch of people tune out, because it doesn't really hurt my business. In fact, it tells me about the customers. So because of the way they were distributing content, they didn't use the data in the same way. What do you make of the Carlton Cuse quote? I personally look at the Carlton Cuse quote and think he's measuring quality in the wrong way. And what do I mean by that? The traditional way of measuring the success of a show is Nielsen ratings. How many people watched this show last night? And if you were to expand to have a bunch more content, of course, you're going to have fewer viewers for any particular piece of content. But that's not how Netflix measures the quality of their shows. Netflix measures the quality of their shows based on whether you renew your subscription next month. And so it's much less about finding something that's broadly applicable and much more about finding something that people really love. This is a quote from Roy Price on that same idea, where he's saying, imagine you've got two different shows. One show you show to a test audience and everybody likes it. And another show you show to a test audience and only 30% of the people like it, but those 30% love it and they're going to show up every single week. In a broadcast world, you want the broadly applicable show. In an on-demand streaming world, you want the show that people are really, really passionate about. I've been ignoring the chat. Dylan's right. The NFL is a bit of a false analogy. But even more important than that, I really think he was looking at the NFL and saying, hey, if you've got a lot of teams, you're going to have lower quality content. And in the same way, if you've got a lot of content out there, you're going to have fewer viewers. I think that's the wrong way of measuring value. So right way of measuring value, if you're running a broadcast TV channel, I think it's the wrong way of measuring value for these streamers. Here's the last question we wanted to wrestle with, is what can industry leaders do to respond? And I'm reasonably proud that in 2016, our answer was, the Netflix, Amazon, and Google are vertically integrating upstream into your business. You need to vertically integrate downstream to compete with them as distributors. And quite frankly, we've seen a lot of that with the studios. So, Disney opening Disney Plus, HBO Max and Warner Brothers, NBC Universal and Peacock, Paramount Plus, a whole bunch of these companies are getting into competing platforms, which brings me to what I think is the next interesting question. And this is an informal case study I do in the class I teach called Why Does Hulu Suck? And the setup for the case study is Hulu should have been, by all observational, by everything you could see about Hulu should have destroyed Netflix. Hulu was a fast follower to Netflix. Hulu was announced within 2 months of when Netflix was originally announced, and it was launched a year later. It had 3 and later 4 of the major studios associated with it, so it had access to a whole bunch of content. A whole bunch of people thought it was going to be lousy, but in fact, technically, it was a great delivery platform. And if you look at their shows, their shows were actually successful by a lot of metrics. So between 2008 and 2018, Hulu won 47 Emmys, or had 47 Emmy nominations, 6 Golden Globe nominations, and had 25 million subscribers. And these are all great until you compare it to Netflix. And in that same time frame, Netflix just absolutely dominated Hulu. So the question in 2018 is, why hasn't Hulu been more successful? Hulu in 2018 was the 8th most popular online video streaming site, way behind Netflix and YouTube and Amazon, the same 3 people who we started off by saying weren't going to be a threat. We talk a little bit about this. I won't spend too much time on this, but you can think about what might be able to help Hulu. One would be, and I think this is kind of fun, is when I teach this in class, I make a big deal about the fact that Hulu had 4 different major studios as partners. And so it should have been able to get access to all of that great content and really heavily compete with Netflix. And when you play around with the case, what you discover is the fact that it had 4 major studios was actually the reason that it wasn't able to compete in the market. If you were Disney and you knew that any success of Hulu was going to be shared with your 3 closest competitors, why on earth would you share your best content with that network? And the same thing for NBCU. Why would you invest in the success of this shared platform when 70% of that success is going to go to some of your closest competitors? So I'd argue one of the problems with Hulu is that it had this shared ownership structure. Guess what happened in early 2017? Disney bought Fox. All of a sudden we have 60% ownership stake. And then a couple months later, Disney, the 10% ownership of AT&T and Warner Brothers got sold to Disney, and then ultimately NBC sold out. So all of a sudden, Disney became the sole owner of Hulu and is now using it, I think, fairly effectively as part of their big bundle. The other thing that's really interesting is when the studios entered this business model, they had to change their ownership structure. They had to change their organizational structure. So historically, studios have had a television division, a theatrical division, a home entertainment division, and an international division. And each of those divisions has a division president, and that division president is in charge of protecting that part of the business. So if you're the president of home entertainment, part of your bonus is based on what were your home entertainment sales last year. So that organizational structure is really good for preserving the old business model, but it's going to create some huge problems for us when we try to go after a new business model, because the president of theatricals going to want to protect the theatrical business, home entertainment's going to want to protect home entertainment, television, international, blah, blah, blah. In April of 2019, Disney actually, as they were launching Disney Plus, did a major reorganization of their organizational structure. And if we were doing this in class, I've got a clip of Bob Iger talking about this. And he said, when we launched Disney Plus, I looked at my organizational structure and it didn't make sense anymore for this new business model. And then I looked at Netflix and I realized Netflix doesn't have a theatrical home entertainment television international division. Netflix has someone who's in charge of content creation and someone who's in charge of the platform. And so, says Bob Iger, I shifted from our old organizational structure to an organizational structure that looks a lot like Netflix. We've got a head of content creation, we've got a head of platforms, and in the case of Disney, they've got a head of parks and resorts. Warner did something very similar. Last thing is, I think, and this is where I think you guys come in if you're interested in this part of the business. The last thing you need to do is change the organizational culture. The organizational culture in all the studios is we make decisions based on gut feel. Is this movie going to sell a lot in the studio, in the theaters or not? We sit around at a table and all of the smart people who have good gut feels make a decision and we go make that movie. That's not the way I would argue Netflix makes decisions about their content. They're much more data driven, not necessarily with changing the creative, but with saying how many people on my platform are interested in this type of content, how interested are they likely to be in it, and I'm going to use my platform to get this content in front of the exactly the right people. And the last piece of this on the entertainment side that I want to talk about is just the policy questions. And here again, there are a whole bunch of fascinating public policy questions out there. One that's really salient right now is when NBC Universal said that they were going to launch some of their movies on their platform at the same time they were in the theaters, AMC came out and said, well, if you launch your movies on your platform, we'll just boycott all of your movies. Is that a good public policy move or not? I think we need some smart public policy people to think really hard about that. Okay. So here's another interesting question. Where else might this apply? And at the beginning of the pandemic, I heard Michael Drake, due respect, at the time, president of Ohio State University, get asked a question about how he thought about the future of higher education. And what he said is, I'm very optimistic about universities broadly. And then he went on to say that universities have been really great at adapting to big changes throughout the century. And in fact, over the last 500 years, the same 70 or so universities have dominated the higher education business, which to me sounds a lot like what the studios were saying in 2015. None of the technological shifts I've faced in the past have changed my power. Why would today be any different? And so in last June, I wrote a piece in The Atlantic called "Our Universities Going the Way of CDs and Cable TV?" It's a provocative title, but the argument I was trying to make is the same technological shifts that have changed the entertainment industry and a whole bunch of other industries that we've looked at also apply to higher education. And right now I'm working on a book that hopefully will come out next fall, where I'm trying to apply some of the same questions we talked about in the entertainment industry book to higher education. Is technology changing the power of traditional institutions of higher education? Is technology going to hurt the quality of higher education? And what can leaders in higher education do to respond? So hopefully that'll be out. And if you come to Carnegie Mellon, I'd love to chat with you about it. The big thing I want to close with before we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers, the big thing I want to close with is, I think for you who are thinking about what do you want to study next, I think there are a whole bunch of really fun opportunities at the interface between technology, management, and policy. And in particular, the introduction of data and detailed customer level data for the studios creates a whole bunch of really fun places where you can play, where you can say, okay, how can we use this data to allow content creators to create great content and then get that content in front of exactly the right people? And how might we want to look at public policy changes in terms of what studios can and can't do by co-owning a distribution platform? And I think those questions and similar questions in other industries really, really need the sort of people that we're training at the Heinz College. People who understand the technology at a detail level, but also understand the management of the industry and understand the public policy implications of these changes, and are able to put all of those things together into a single package to go out and lead some of these industries that are changing rapidly and who I would argue desperately need new blood and new leaders. Okay, so with that, I'll close. I'm loving the interactions in the chat. I'd be more than happy to either talk about these questions or have you guys unmute yourselves and ask me any question you want. I have tenure, so I don't get a commission if you come or you don't come. I'll answer you honestly. And would love to just interact with you about any questions you have.
Just for the sake of keeping everything uncensored and open here, I'm going to stop the recording now. So I want to thank everybody for attending this session. Thank you to Mike for a great job. And please do continue. Yes, please do continue the conversation here, even though I'm stopping the recording.